I thought the MDR was practically impossible to build incorrectly, but these two players managed to prove me wrong. What kind of maniac runs the Gemtech 1? Strangely enough, I picked up both of these guns in the same raid. First the 5.56 MDR, and then a decked out 7.62 version right afterwards. A flare? Oh, it is a flare. I didn't even see. So let's bring them back into the workshop to see what's up. So we've got both of these guns back into the workshop to go and have a look. And we'll start looking at the black MDR first, because this one is a little bit more tasty than the other one. Now, the thing that I want to talk about first and foremost, before we even talk about the gun build at all, is just the relative strength of the MDR versus other weapons, because this guy took quite a significant nerf recently with this patch. So irrespective of what you think about the actual build itself, really a bigger question is around whether you think you should be using the MDR at all. And especially now that the 25 rounders are much more restricted, something like the SCAR might be better. Now, I did a video about the SCAR recently, but I do want to showcase this first before we jump into it to show you just the relative performance of the two. So I'm going to swap this over to this guy, which is the Voodoo. I'm going to put this onto a weapon that I've showcased previously. This is the mid-length barrel SCAR, so it's not even the best recoil SCAR that you can get. We're going to look at the performance between the two different weapons, because I think you'll be quite surprised, and especially people who are still kind of MDR converts will be quite surprised to see what the difference is. You can see I've already done a little bit here, but you'll be able to obviously see what's going on when we move up closer and start firing it. So this is the MDR, and this is how the MDR looks now on full auto. Okay, and this is how the SCAR looks on full auto. So let's look at it from about here maybe. I think this will showcase it quite nicely. You see how violent it feels. We move along a little bit and use the SCAR instead. What's weird about it, and this is kind of the same for a lot of the guns in Tarkov now, the recoil patterns do actually kind of look very similar. But when you're actually using them, if you just look at the way the spray pattern went, one is just way more jumpy than the other. Let me try and control it on both and just see how that feels. Just about managed to keep it under control. The SCAR just feels way better. So, irrespective of what you think about the gun, I genuinely don't think the MDR is actually that good anymore. You do have to make some quite significant trade-offs in order to run this particular weapon. And so, I think that you may want to use just a different gun entirely. But, you know, some people are still going to want to use the MDR, so let's have a look into the actual build itself. So, the first thing first, let's take off this scope and put back on the flare. Now, we talked before about the combination of the RK2, and this is another situation where the RK2 just basically ruins this build. This build is now not really very good. And one reason for this is because the ergonomics is so low now, even though this is a bullpup and usually has quite high ergo to start with, the ergo is so low on it that you actually end up getting overswing because of the introduction of both the flare and the suppressor. So I've taken the liberty of building out this gun over on db4tarkov/gun, which is a very good website for looking at gun builds and working out what's going to be good and what's not good. And you can see here there's a little calculator which shows overswing yes or no, and evo ergo delta, which is basically the combination of ergonomics and weight together in one consolidated number to help you figure this out before you build your gun. And as you can see, the combination of the flare and the RK2 together means that the evo ergo delta goes negative, and that means that there's overswing on the weapon. Practically, what does this mean? Well, when we jump into the hideout, even with low weight, when we ADS this weapon, we're going to have overswing on the reticle, like this. And the flare is already hard enough to aim without having to deal with this particular reticle overswing thing. If you're on the 2.25 zoom, it doesn't matter so much, but you can still see it here. You know, you're trying to aim at somebody's head. You're counteracting the fact that your character is both strafing and there's overswing happening at the same time. It's just one extra thing that you just don't want to have to be dealing with, especially if you're using a thermal sight. It's just really, really bad. Now, you can avoid this by going back to the website, as we said, and we can put on basically any grip that we like. It doesn't really matter. You can even put on an RVG, and that's going to fix your problem. The best one for the MDR is typically this one, the M-Lock AFG Tactical Grip. Because it removes the use of the rail, this ends up putting you in a very small positive ergo territory, and this actually is either the same or very slightly better than the SE5, interestingly, even though it's a much cheaper part. So we're going to go over and put that on, and I'll show you that this is actually the case. So I'm going to go and edit build, and we'll take this off, and we're going to put on, it doesn't really matter which one you choose, grey, black, whatever you want. We'll just buy that, stick it on, and we'll go back into the hideout, and I'll show you now that that has now gone, that overswing is now gone. So this is going to be much easier to aim with. There you go. So there you go. Full zoom, aim, snap straight on the head. This is 10 times easier to aim with than it was before. And the thing is, right, the difference between this gun and the other gun, it's just not worth it. What you're going from here is 93 vertical recoil, which is pretty high. But if you go over to the M-Lock 4.1 inch and then into the RK2, you're talking about 90. So really all you've done is save 3 recoil, and it's not going to make any practical difference to the recoil pattern of the gun. It's already still quite high at medium distances, but you're destroying your ergonomics and you're destroying the ability to aim straight on with the flare, which is already quite hard to aim with. So that's one of the reasons why I think that this gun build is actually cursed and should definitely not be used. Two other parts to this weapon build. The first one, again, we were talking about the MDR itself as a base platform. If you want to use the flare, this is a pretty bad weapon to use it on. There is no canted sight for the MDR, which makes it a poor candidate for the flare, because normally you want to have something on the side so that you can aim at close range, or at least just, you know, look around and not be using the flare sometimes. Like, having a combination between the two is pretty good. And going back to our SCAR, you can indeed add a canted on this. It's kind of hard to see. It's hidden behind this SCAR cheek pad, but it's right in front of the scope there. If you add this MPR45 mount, then you can add something on the back. I usually just add delta point, so I'm going to stick that on. And as I said, yes, you can swap this over, and this could use the flare instead, like so, and then that allows you to use both. So you could use the flare and also something on the side. So I feel like, again, the SCAR is probably a better choice for this in particular. Then another non-structural problem that can be fixed that I thought was kind of interesting is the fact that there is no laser or flashlight on this particular gun. So if they do end up in close combat and they have to point fire you, then this is going to go all over the place. Again, we can go in and compare these two things together if we want to. So let's just go and get the SCAR and let's take it into the firing range, or I'll just show you the difference between these two. This is the MDR as it is, as the person has built it. There we go, in point fire. And here is the SCAR. Way more accurate, there's less spray. That was actually not a bad spray pattern, but the thing you have to remember about the point fire without using a tactical device is that the point fire is random and the spray pattern is not consistent, and that's one of the worst parts about it. Sometimes it'll go up here and off to the left, sometimes it'll go up and then straight down again, sometimes it'll go round to the right and then back to the left again. It's a bit random, whereas if you've got a tactical device on, it's great. The one that I have on here is the one I almost always use, which is underneath, as you can see, it's the WMX200, and I actually have this in IR mode, so that actually keeps the nice tight grouping for the point fire mode, and rather than having it off, I'm actually changing the mode on the tactical device here. I'm not turning it on and off, I'm just using Control-T to turn it on between flashlight and then the IR flashlight, which is a much better way of doing it. It means I'm always retaining my point fire bonus without turning it on and off, but in the day, people can't see it, so they can't see it like a laser. I'm not giving away my position. Okay, so now we've dealt with the black MDR. Let us move over to the other one, this MDR here. This one is a 5.56 MDR. This is slightly different, uses a different caliber, so recoil is much less of a problem, down in the 60s rather than up in the 90s, which is a bit better. But this one has got a cardinal sinful thing happen to it, which is the Gemtech 1. Now, I don't understand why anybody would ever use this. If they just have it hanging around in their stash, you really should just sell it and buy something else. There's really no reason to ever use this suppressor. You can sell them at 30k, about 30k on the flea market, but there are other alternatives that are just the same price, and it's just lazy not to remove this because there are better alternatives. So because this gun is a bullpup, you could well argue that, yeah, there's not really much point putting on the best suppressor because the vertical recoil is not going to matter too much. If you go and add the Griffin, for example, which is the best suppressor for 5.56, then this only takes you down to 53 vertical recoil, which is still significantly different compared to where we were before. But is it going to matter that much? And it's also quite expensive. I don't know. That's really up to you. One little random point that I want to make, by the way, that we figured out with chat the other day, is that this reorders all the time, and I've talked about this before, but if you wishlist the parts, they do actually show up with this surround on them. So I'm wishlisting both the SF3P, because I use that all the time, and the G-Lock, so I can find them in the list. So if I take the G-Lock off, you can see both of these parts here, SF3P there, and the G-Lock there. They're much more obvious to find in the list. So if you're using a part over and over again, make sure that you go and wishlist it. You can't do it directly from here, unfortunately. If you go and find it, you can add it to the wish list, and I'm adding mine into equipment. It doesn't really matter which one you choose, but then they do show up in this list with a little wish list border around them. It just makes it easier to build, so we're doing it that way. Now, my personal preference then, so yeah, you could go the G-Lock, go for the minimum recoil, but it's quite expensive. My personal preference is SF3P, and then we put on the Mini Monster. Now, I've talked about the Mini Monster so many times. I think it's one of the best suppressors in the game, especially in the light of the recoil rework that was done 2 patches ago, because recoil is so much less impactful now and ergonomics matters more. But this has one really interesting benefit for the MDR. Being a bullpup, it's already quite a short weapon, especially when your PMC is holding it. And let me show you the difference when you're fighting in CQB. So this has got the Gemtech 1 on it still. Imagine that we're fighting around this table or something. If I get too close to the table, the gun starts to push back into my PMC's body, and then eventually if I get too close, then it folds in. And at this point, you will actually shoot over to the left. If you fire at this point, the gun does actually shoot, and it will shoot somewhere into the wall. So if you're trying to lean around the corner, and you're getting your barrel stuffed into your PMC's body, it is really awkward and really annoying to fight. There's also this element of the left-hand lean as well. As soon as you go anywhere near an object, your left-hand lean turns back into a right-hand lean, and there's a fairly slow transition between left and right, which I find super, super annoying. So with these two elements, what does the mini monster help with? Well, let's put one on, just so we can see what the difference actually is. You will notice that it is practically impossible to get yourself barrel stuffed. It is possible if you like walk into the table and you're also moving at the same time. You can sometimes get it to happen, but like that, just on the corner. But it's almost impossible to happen in most situations. So when you're leaning around the corner, all that happens is your gun goes up into your PMC's body, but it doesn't actually fold over to the side. So this is much, much easier. If somebody comes running up right against you, the chances are that you're going to be able to continue to shoot them while they're going to have their guns stuck against them. And this is one of the massive benefits of the mini monster. So your gun is a lot shorter and it's so much easier to fight around corners. Now, the only thing that I would say about this is, unfortunately, it doesn't actually affect this left-hand lean mechanic, which is a real shame because you're not really going anywhere near the table, to be honest, and the gun is actually shorter. But as soon as you move the muzzle towards the table, it still moves you over back to the left again, which is a pain. So it doesn't fix that, but it does fix this barrel stuffing problem and allow you to, use cover much more easily, shoot around cover, and use boxes without your gun sort of folding in on itself, which is really, really good. The other part about the mini monster is that this is strictly better than the Gemtech 1. The Gemtech 1 is probably the worst suppressor in the entire game. There's a very handy guide, again over on DB for Tarkov. If you go into Combo All, when you click on the muzzle brake, this will actually show you the recoil and the ergonomics of every combination of all of the different suppressors. So this kind of makes my sheet superfluous. I do actually have a spreadsheet here that I've used previously, which I've shown on screen and stuff on stream and in lots of videos. And this shows you that, the Griffin, Syensqo, AAC, and AWC Thor are the best. And down here, we've got the Gemtech 1, which is terrible. It's actually worse than the Hybrid 46, which really is saying something. There's only one suppressor that's worse than this, which is the Rotor 43, which is kind of the noob trap one because it's the only one that attaches straight to the barrel most of the time. But you can just do this in DB for Tarkov instead. And you can see here, if we've got this ordered by recoil and we scroll all the way down to the bottom, then you can see the Hybrid 46 is here. We've got the Gemtech 1, which is even lower than it down there somewhere, which is just like truly, truly awful, with -6 recoil and -20 ergo. If we go up to the top, some of these are just a lot better. If you sort this by Evo ergo and we move the recoil up a little bit, you'll see the mini monsters start to appear quite early in the list. This is obviously one of the best for ergonomics out of all of them. Go to SF3P and the mini monster. And that is actually going to improve both our ergonomics and our recoil at the same time, whilst also making our guns shorter and improving our Evo ergo delta here. The other thing that I would say about this build is that the SE5 is just kind of unnecessary. Like we said before, the AFG M-locks are basically better on the MDR than the SE5, and this thing is quest locked and really expensive. So there's really no need to use this. I've transferred over, because of partly Tarkov DB, I've transferred over to using these AFG M-lock grips on pretty much every single gun that has an M-lock handguard, because there's just no need to use anything else. I did go and build this over in DB for Tarkov as well here, and you can see on this we've got 4.7 Evo ergo delta. We're actually really close to the threshold, even though we're running a red dot because of the 60 round mag and the terribleness of the Gemtech 1. But if we remove this, that's 4.7, we remove this, and we remove this, and then we go in to add one of these, we actually get to 4.9. And this is partly because of the lack of weight from the M-lock 4.1 inch rail. You can see, even though it doesn't actually affect your stats in any way, technically speaking, because of a small amount of weight, it's the equivalent of -1.1 ergonomics. So you end up losing out slightly. And also, these AFG M-locks are really, really light, 0.04 of a kilogram versus the one that we were just looking at, which is the SE5, which ends up being 0.09. And so the combination of adding this M-lock rail and the weight of the SE5 itself versus just a straight up AFG M-lock foregrip, for the MDR at least, ends up being better. The relationship's not super straightforward. This isn't always the case, but practically speaking, you're never going to notice difference between the two. So I'm pretty much picking the AFG M-lock all the time now. The final part to this, given we're talking about everything, is the Balder Pro. To be honest, I mean, this is a bit of a fringe one, but I just don't really like the Balder Pro very much. Ever since I did my flashlights video, the Balder Pro has been proven to be quite weak. I mean, you can look at that. There's not very much throw. It doesn't really help that much in terms of visibility over long distances. It does have a laser, and it's very cheap, so some people do use it for that. But if you're using the laser, it actually gets even less bright. It's not that bright to begin with, like this, and when you put the laser on, it actually reduces the brightness of the beam, unfortunately, because it's using some power for the laser, I presume. It's just not a very good flashlight. That's why I think if you're looking for flashlights in particular, then you should probably use something like the Army Tech Predator, but unfortunately that doesn't give you any point fire bonus, so that's why I use the WMX. If you want a combo, then you're probably looking at something like the Clash. But for the full video there, I do have an entire thing about flashlights and lasers you can go and watch if you want to decide what is best. But I would avoid using the Balder Pro. Even the X400, whilst not being the best, is still better than the Balder Pro. So I would avoid using that if you can. But as I said, that one's kind of fringe, but we may as well mention it given it was on the weapon and it's something that I personally would change. So there you have it. 2 weapons that I thought were basically impossible to get wrong, but yeah, people always do find a way. So as usual, a big shout out to all my patrons, and as always, have fun in your raids.